Hi, I'm Talia Baroncelli, and you're watching theAnalysis-news. I'll shortly be joined by economist Dr. Matin Qaim to speak about food security globally. If you're watching this show for the first time, please consider going to our website, theanalysis.news, and getting on our mailing list. That way, you'll be notified every time a new episode drops. You can also donate to the show by hitting the donate button at the top right corner of the screen. See you in a bit with Dr. Matin Qaim. Joining me now to speak about issues of food security is Professor Matin Qaim. He's the director of the Center for Development Research in Bonn, here in Germany. So thank you very much for joining me today, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I think one of the entry points into our discussion today is obviously the grain deal between Russia and Ukraine, which unfortunately has fallen through. And over the past year, this grain deal has really helped the global south with food security to ensure that they, are able to put enough food on the table. So perhaps we can first discuss what the implications are of this grain deal falling apart.
Yes, sure. I mean, let's think last year when the Russian aggression and the war broke out in February. I mean, we have to understand that both Russia and Ukraine are not only very large food producers, but also very large food exporters. So together, these two countries export around a third of the total wheat that's traded internationally. For maize, it's also large. For other grains, for sunflower oil, large quantities and large shares. And these exports, most of them go out through the Black Sea normally. And Black Sea harbors. And with the outbreak of the war, for a couple of weeks, there were no ships going out. And then because it was war zone, and then the Russian ships were starting to go out, but the Ukrainian ships not, because they were blockaded by Russian ships and they just couldn't leave the ports without being shot. And that situation persisted for a couple of months, and it led to skyrocketing prices on international markets. And that means all those countries that are dependent on food imports had not only to pay much, much more, prices were doubling in a relatively short period of time. They didn't only have to pay much, much more, but some of these countries were just unable to get the quantities they needed because there was this shortage on international markets. And then in the summer of 2022, this grain deal between Russia and Ukraine, with backing of Turkey and the United Nations, was implemented and established, and that meant that gradually also the Ukraine exports could resume, and that led to calming down of markets. Prices internationally went down to more normal levels. They were still high, but much lower than they used to be during peak times. And that was good because many of the poor countries with food insecurity are importers of food. And that means they had much better access, and some of the worst crises that we were all concerned about could be prevented. And now this situation came to a halt with Russia, stepping out of this deal recently, and now prices for grains are going up internationally again. They haven't, shot up like doubling of prices. They have gone up for the last 10 days. And there are some concerns about, again, food insecurity increasing in the world. And we are particularly looking at a bunch of countries in Africa, the Middle East, and in Asia. So there's scarcity of quantities, there's uncertainty. The situation is not as bleak as it used to be in 2022, simply because some of the quantities now go out via land from Ukraine. They go out by train, they go out by trucks, and so parts of the exports happen. But still, it's a situation that's increasing the international risks of food insecurity.
Well, Ukraine has been known as the breadbasket of the world, and of course, Ukraine has, provided so much grain to the global south. But of course, it's not the only source of grain and different cereals. So, what have countries been doing to meet their agricultural and food needs? Have they been diversifying, or have there been more perhaps projects on the ground or subsidies to be able to become more self subsistent or self sufficient?
Yeah, a bunch of different things. I mean, first of all, there are other countries exporting, and Russia is the largest wheat exporter, and Russia continues to export. And Russia had a good harvest in 2022, and also a very good harvest as it seems to be this year. So Russia is trying to make up for some of the quantities that Ukraine is not exporting, and so Russia is basically stepping out of the grain deal in order to hurt Ukraine. And Ukraine not being able to export and benefiting from rising prices through selling its own wheat, and promising to some African countries to will provide you with the wheat. So obviously that's the narrative that President Putin is providing, and that's not necessarily in the interest of all African countries or of the rest of the world. But what's happening? I mean, obviously, all prices were high, and other. I mean, every country that needs to import was trying in the short run to get imports from somewhere else, so hunger numbers did increase, but not as much as was people were concerned about. Um, I mean, producing more is certainly an option that can only go so far, because you only have the land resources in your country that you have, and you cannot just, extend the land resources. Using more fertilizer is generally an option for some countries, but was difficult because fertilizer prices were skyrocketing as well. So this means there aren't, short-term measures that countries could implement in order to really, increase their own production. Of course, in the longer run, investing in new types of technologies is an option, but that's not happening overnight. So the question of, where are the foods coming from that some African countries need in the future remains a relevant question. And increasing African own agricultural production is an important goal, but obviously that needs investment that takes some time.
Well, before we get into some of those other technologies, I was wondering, before the war in Ukraine, these other factors, economic factors, were also affecting food security, such as, the pandemic, which had all sorts of supply chain issues, and of course, inflation. So, have you seen countries become a bit more resilient, particularly in the global south, to be better equipped to deal with these issues, or has it actually become worse in the past few years?
I mean, first of all, it became worse in the past few years. Exactly those factors that you were mentioning contributed to a situation of food insecurity that was there anyway. I mean, we still have a world where close to 800 million people are going hungry to bed every night. But the pandemic led to a situation where hunger numbers increased, and the supply chain disruptions that you mentioned were an important part of that. But the other part that's often not sufficiently clearly seen is the income losses that the lockdown measures that were implemented in most countries really meant. I mean, we're talking about poor people who are deriving their income from informal employment. And all this informal employment for a number of months just stopped. And this means the income stream stopped. So it was not only that prices of foods increased, but at the same time, increased incomes decreased, and this is a clear reason for increasing hunger, especially among poor people who need to spend a large share of their income on food anyway. And the inflation continued not only because of the COVID pandemic, but also because of rising energy prices and other international issues and the Russian war. And so we are still seeing a situation where food prices are high. By historical standards, and this is making the goal of food security more difficult. So, yes, we are living in challenging times, and food security cannot be taken for granted, unfortunately.
So, if countries are so integrated into the world economy, how can they ensure that they have food security? I mean, how much control do they even have over world prices? And is there anything that they can do in terms of local strategies to make those to lower those prices or to make access to food more affordable?
Yeah, I mean, every country, of course, from a resilience perspective, needs to see what's produced at home and where do you rely on international markets. But we're looking, especially with a view to Africa, to a situation where the population numbers are increasing and the land resources are scarce. And that's something that we're also seeing in many parts of Asia, not only in Africa. So many developing countries, even if they increase their agricultural production, which should have high priority, will not become self-sufficient overall in food. So they will depend on food imports. And this is one of the reasons why the borders need to stay open. There's nothing like, food self-sufficiency for every country. If all countries would close down their borders, we would have, numbers of hungry people that are probably 3 or 4 times as high as they are anyway. And that's also the reason why Russia and Ukraine, with not so large populations, but a lot of land and a lot of water available, are major exporters. I mean, we just have an unequal distribution or an unequal ratio of population versus land and water resources. And this will even become worse with climate change, because climate change, all the predictions and all the models are telling us the countries worst affected are those in the global south, are the countries in Africa, are the countries in Asia, where heat waves and agriculture production will become so difficult, and also much more erratic. There's a drought in one season, there's suddenly a flood in another season, and of course, agriculture production suffers from that. These effects will be much worse in Africa and Asia than in Europe, for instance, and this is leading to the additional insight that without trade, this is not going to work. So countries should increase their agriculture production by wise investments to the extent possible, but that's not instead of imports. Imports will remain important for many countries, and diversification, not being dependent on one or two countries. This is what may countries help to not, be too much affected by international disruptions. Because if one country drops out, which can always happen, then you have a sufficient, number of other sources where to get your food from.
Well, you did mention trade, which is, of course, a very important factor, but how do you balance the right amount of trade with, trying to avoid the destruction of local economies and with maybe even instituting certain protectionist measures? Because the EU, for example, heavily subsidizes its agricultural sector. And, if certain African countries were to do the same, would that help them out, or would that have the opposite effect?
Yeah, I mean, the question is, what do we mean with subsidies? What we need in Africa is a major investment into agriculture. And this means agricultural technology. This means agricultural training and education for farmers. This means improved road and irrigation infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So major investments are needed. And this is, of course, a subsidy. That money has to come from public funds, be it African governments, but certainly also to some extent from the international donor community. And African countries and also Asian countries are well advised to prioritize investments into agriculture because, yeah, I mean, it's just so important for food security. It's not only for producing more food, it's also because many of the poor and hungry people are farmers. So it's also providing an improvement into their income earning potential by increasing their productivity. This is really, really important. But when we talk about resilience, then so far we have talked about mostly resilience, meaning insulation from international shocks. But resilience also means being resilient to climate shocks. And when you have closed borders, you're doing everything at home, and then climate shock strikes, then of course you're much less resilient. So you need to balance international sourcing with local production. And I think the answer, what the right balance is, depends on the conditions in every country. How much land do you have? What potential do you have to produce certain types of crops versus others? And what other economic potentials do you have in order to provide income and employment for your local population? So there's no one size fits all solution, but I think the general statement that we need stronger investments into African agriculture is certainly one that holds across the board.
Would this investment be primarily for larger agricultural companies, like big agrochemical companies, or would there be a way to also encourage small scale forms of farming, such as ecological forms of farming? And what would those small forms of farming actually look like on a bigger scale?
I mean, a focus on the small farm sector is very important simply because hundreds of millions of poor people depend on small scale farming for their livelihoods. So we can't imagine a situation of only large scale farms where all of these people would lose their jobs and their livelihoods. So a focus on small farms is important, but small farms doesn't necessarily mean it's low tech. I mean, small farms also need access to good technology, be it improved seeds that are not only high yielding, but also robust to climatic and weather shocks that are resistant to pests and diseases. They may also benefit, small scale farmers may also benefit from certain forms of digital technologies, providing better access to information, better access to weather forecasts and market intelligence. So what we shouldn't do is equate small scale farming with subsistence, low tech agriculture. We need to make small scale farmers fit for the market with the best appropriate and locally adapted technologies available. And that is technology that partly has to come from the public sector, but obviously also technology that can come to some extent from the private sector. So there's nothing against competitive markets and companies providing technologies to small scale farmers, as long as these technologies are really targeting the needs of small scale farmers and are accessible in terms of yeah what they cost and what the benefits are that they can bring to smallholders.
But arguably, the market hasn't really been the best arbiter or efficient way to ensure that farmers are able to get all of their goods on the local or the international market. I mean, it seems like there's been a lot of waste when it comes to food. A lot of food is wasted. Not everything that is produced is actually consumed, and there are also inequalities between what certain people consume in terms of the nutrition, the content of the food they're consuming, versus people in perhaps wealthier countries. So what would the interventions be in the market, the economic interventions necessary to ensure that people are consuming enough food that's actually nutritionally dense, so to speak, and that there aren't as many inequalities?
Yeah, I mean, one of the important factors is that a few preconditions need to be met for markets to be able to work efficiently and fairly. So, to give you the example of road infrastructure, I mean, if small scale farmers and communities have no access to roads, then they cannot get the inputs and technologies they need on time, and they can also not market their produce. Or if they market it and with very bad road conditions, a lot of this will be lost and spoiled. So here we need investments into improved infrastructure, and this can only come from the public sector. So there's no company that will build the road to a small scale village, at least most of the time. So this is really something where public investments are needed. Once that public investment is made, markets start to work better, and then also private sector involvement will increase. And you did mention nutritious access to nutritious foods. Infrastructure is particularly important for perishable fruits and vegetables and these types of foods, because when you have a truck of grain or even a donkey cart of grain, I mean that's not going to spoil so fast. So even if it takes longer and there's a bumpy road, you will get your wheat or your rice grain to the market, but not your tomatoes and not your pumpkins and what have you. I mean, on a bumpy road, they will just spoil and be damaged. And if it's not getting fast enough under some cooling conditions, it's also not going to work. And this is one of the reasons why access to really nutritious foods is so difficult, especially for poor people in rural areas. They may harvest some of the nutritious foods during certain seasons of the year, but for the rest of the year, they are running without access to sufficient nutritious foods because it's not reaching their places, coming in from other places. So markets aren't necessarily bad, but markets need to be put into a position that they can really work, and that's what's key.
And when it comes to nutrition, I'm sure this is a very complex issue, but would you say it's more of a supply side or a demand side issue? Is it more about investing in this particular, green leafy vegetables or other produce that's really healthy and nutritious and ensuring that those prices are maybe kept low so that people can afford them? Or is it also about educating people to, buy the right products and to kind of incentivize them to consume healthy food?
It's a mixture of both, obviously, but so far, when you're educating people and making them aware of how important it is to eat, enough quantities of nutritious foods, but these are either not available or they are very, very expensive during large parts of the year, then the whole awareness building doesn't really help. On the other hand, if you're producing much, much more and increase availability and prices are reduced, but there's no awareness. I mean, it's also culturally that people obviously are adjusted to what is available at affordable prices. So yes, that type of awareness building and changing consumption behavior and preferences is important as well. I anyway think that the whole question of food security, we need to always keep both the supply side and the demand side in the picture. Also, when we look at how can we on our small planet actually ensure that there is a sufficient food produced for 10 billion people and potentially more, well, it's going to work partly with the right technologies, but it's not going to work when we're all consuming and having lifestyles as we here in Western Europe tend to have, with lots of meat and animal sourced foods consumption. So it's a mixture, and consumption changes will be required not only for poor people that suffer from food insecurity, but will be required also from from rich people and countries that just have too much waste and use way too many resources and have a climate and environmental footprint that's just completely unfair from a global perspective.
And also, we're kind of getting into the issue of climate change now. You've just brought that up. How do these policies of food security ensure that there's still a certain amount of biodiversity maintained, that there's no, or that there aren't high levels of land degradation, and that externalities, environmental externalities, or planetary boundaries, the limits of the planet and the ecosystems we're living in? How do food security experts deal with those issues and try to find ways around that?
Yeah, I mean, the goal is to provide sustainable food security. And sustainable means that it's not only about enough and healthy food for human health, but we also need to preserve environmental health. So it's for the planet as a whole. And when we are looking at how much food and agriculture contributes to some of the big environmental issues, climate change, biodiversity loss, we're seeing, wow, it's tremendous. I mean, the food and agriculture sector is responsible for about one third of all climate gas emissions. And it's very clear that we can't continue like this. If we want to get to a climate neutral economy, then it's also the agricultural sector that needs to find ways of, emitting less. Uh, Climate gases, and the same for biodiversity. I mean, when you're looking at what are the biggest threats to biodiversity internationally, it's the expansion of the agricultural land into the forests, into the natural habitats. So, in a way, we need to find technologies that need less land because land conversion is not only the biggest threat to biodiversity, but is also one of the major sources of greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, if you're considering a hectare of forest that you're deforesting in order to plant wheat on it, all the carbon that's being in the soil and in the biomass, is lost, is going into the atmosphere and is contributing to climate change. One of the big sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So agriculture on less land can only work with better technologies, right? Better technologies that provide more per hectare of land. This is one of the avenues, and the other avenues is we need to change consumption styles. I mean, a meat-heavy diet is needing so much more land and is leading to so much more greenhouse gas emissions than a plant-based diet. And this means plant-based diets, which doesn't necessarily mean we all have to become vegans, but we seriously need to reduce high quantities of meat and animal-sourced foods. That's true for people who eat a lot, and that's for most people in the rich world. If you look at Africa, for instance, where poor people eat very little animal sourced foods, you would say, well, animal sourced foods also have a role to play in healthy nutrition to some extent. So we need obviously locally adjusted solutions, but the consumption side is an important factor in this.
And one last question. What would the role of fertilizers and pesticides be? Because you've mentioned now that we need to stop burning fossil fuels, we need to decarbonize. But what do the big agrochemical companies, what role do they play? And is it just the pesticides and fertilizers themselves that have environmental impacts, or is it the companies themselves and their scope 1 to 3 emissions that have other downstream effects and other effects on the agricultural sector that are also potentially contributing to these environmental catastrophes.
I mean, fertilizers do contribute to greenhouse gas emissions through two channels. The first is producing nitrogen fertilizer is very energy intensive, and this energy is today coming primarily from burning fossil fuels. Fertilizer production is responsible for about 1% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. The other factor how fertilizer contributes to greenhouse gas emissions is because the nitrogen compounds lead to certain nitrous oxide emissions, which are potent greenhouse gases when you're applying them to the field, and especially if you're applying them with under conditions that are not technically sound. So yes, fertilizers contribute to climate change. However, the share of how much fertilizers contribute to climate change is probably less than what you expect. It's less than 10% from all the emissions from agriculture. I mentioned that food and agriculture is responsible for about 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions. Only 1/10 of this is due to fertilizer. The much bigger source of greenhouse gas emissions is, on the one hand, livestock keeping, uh, and is, on the other hand, land use change. So if you're using fertilizers in order to prevent more forests from being, cut down, then we're actually doing something good to the climate. And this is not necessarily the case in Western Europe, where we use a lot of fertilizer anyway. Here, reductions in fertilizers would be useful. But if we look at many places in Africa where smallholder farmers hardly use any fertilizer, and because they don't have access to fertilizer, and they often, in order to produce more, go into the forest. They cut, down the forest in order to produce more. And if they were given better access to fertilizers, that deforestation could be less. And starting from very low amounts of fertilizers, increasing fertilizer use is something that's good for the climate and the environment because it has so many positive effects on saving land. So it's not necessarily a zero fertilizer world that's the perfect world. It's a world that has much less fertilizer use than what we typically use here in Europe, or also China is using heavy amounts of fertilizer. But we need to see the trade-offs. Finding ways and technologies that help to have a lot of production per unit of land is something good. And I'm not saying fertilizer is the only way of doing that. We need certain amounts of fertilizers, but obviously good breeding and good technology that can help that plants grow well with less fertilizer because they're root systems use the fertilizers better, or we are applying the fertilizers in a more targeted way. All of these are useful technologies. But a zero fertilizer world is one that's problematic because when we are harvesting, we are extracting nutrients from the field. And to some extent, we need to get the nutrients back onto the field. Otherwise, there's no sustainable harvest in the future.
And that would be the same for pesticides then, that you would have
Well,
to.
I mean, pesticides really have to be seen in a slightly different way because pesticides are not adding nutrients. Pesticides are one way of dealing with a problem of pest pressure. Here, I think that other technical ways of dealing with pests have a large potential. More resistant varieties, for instance, more diversity, which in the fields, which can help to reduce pest pressure. Agroforestry systems, where you're combining trees with annual crops, can really help to reduce pest pressure. So I'm not necessarily saying that everything can be done completely with zero pesticides, but there are very interesting technical options and agronomic options to reduce the use of chemical pesticides, and that's an important avenue for more sustainable production systems.
Well, there's no one size fits all. I think that's the takeaway from what you've said, and that you need very particular local ways of dealing with these issues, and ways which are also connected to the global economy, but that there's no one single solution or one approach to enhancing food security. So, Dr. Matin Qaim from the Center for Development Research in Bonn, thank you very much for joining me today and sharing your insights.
Well, thanks for having me.
And thank you for watching this interview on theAnalysis.news. We really can't make this content without you, so please consider going to our website, theAnalysis.news, and hitting the donate button at the top right corner of the screen. Get on our mailing list so you don't miss any future episodes, and see you next time.